Okay, so today we're taking a look at the beginning of Unit 2, which is everything you want to know about verbs but were afraid to ask. And so Unit 2 is all about verbs. We're going to find in our time together, now that we've established the 10 sentence patterns, we're going to start looking at the four form classes. So we're going to start off with verbs, then we're going to take a look at nouns, and then we're going to move on to adverbs and then adjectives. And that's going to take us a long time. It's going to take us into the beginning of April to kind of get through all of that. So today we're going to start in on our unit on verbs. Unit 2 is a pretty short unit, so we're focusing on Chapter 3, this logic of a seemingly illogical English verb. And the thing is, if you take a foreign language, I think you'll find, like in foreign languages, like Spanish, that conjugating verbs in other languages seems so easy. But when you get to English, it seems very complicated, like how we actually form our verbs. And actually, it's really quite logical. We're going to find there's a mathematical equation that we're going to use to actually create all the verbs in the English language. And that's going to be the main crux that we're going to have in this unit, is understanding how we break down the verb. We're going to look at how we construct them and also how we deconstruct them. It's also going to lead us into the other major concept, which is going to be subject-verb agreement, as well as moving from active to passive voice, and then going backwards from passive voice back to active voice. All right, so let's jump into madness here. So there are actually 5 different forms for the verb. So we have what we call the base form, and that's what we would sometimes refer to as the present tense. So words like laugh and eat. We also have the S form of the verb. So as it looks like you just add an S to it. And so we'd say things like laughs and eats. Technically, we call this the present third person singular form. We also know that verbs show up in an ED form, and this is what we would traditionally call the past tense. So we'd have words like laughed or ate. When I say there's an ED form, not every verb, as we know, can literally have an ED. Sometimes there are irregular forms, so that's why we have ate and not eated. We also have the ing form, where we can add an ing to our verb, and this is what we are going to call the present participle. Words like laughing and eating, for example. And lastly, we have the en form. The en form, what we're going to find, is what we call the past participle form. And so we have words like laughed and eaten. Some words, just like the ed form, sometimes they'll literally take the en, so we can go from eat to eaten. But other words won't, so we can't go from laughed to laughing. So once again, with those 2 that we have, with the ed and the en form, you don't always literally add the ed or the en, but there's a variation of those. Those are our 5 forms that we have in a verb. So as the linguists study the language, they realize, okay, these are the 5 forms that verbs show up as. How do they get there, and how do we form this? So we know that a verb sometimes is by itself, and sometimes it also has partners. And so we call those auxiliaries or helping verbs. So if I say the grammar teacher has eaten the donuts as bribery, well, has eaten would be the whole verb. If I said that the cholesterol will be clogging his arteries, that would be the entire verb. So I want you to see, therefore, in yellow, that is our helper verb. But what's in orange is our main verb, and the main verb determines what kind of verb it is. And so even though it might have a be, will be clogging, clogging is an action, so we'd call that an action verb. So once again, what the linguists are looking at is saying, okay, in the English language, we notice they show up in different forms. There's an ing form with the word clogging. There's an en form with the word eaten. How did that happen? They also realize that there are these helpers. And once, as a linguist, we studied how the verb changes in the different patterns. Just like we learned at the 10 sentence patterns, we start studying it long enough, we realize that it's not very haphazard. It's actually very logical of how these verbs are formed. And we create what we call the verb expansion rule. So here's something really important for you to capture, because we're going to practice this today. The verb expansion rule. Basically, we take a predicating verb, a verb which then creates a direct object. And basically what we do is we have 2 things that seem to exist. There are auxiliaries and there are main verbs that kind of combine to create a predicating verb. And then from that, we kind of break down, how did the auxiliary form? And we have like this weird mathematical equation here with T, M, have plus en, be plus ing plus mv. Mv means main verb. But what we find is this mathematical equation actually will create every active voice verb that we can create in the English language. It's just a real simple, logical, mathematical equation. So let's break down what this looks like. So Same formula. I want to talk about what each of these things mean. So the first thing is T. T means tense. All right, so write that down. It's very important. And I want you to note that there are actually only two tenses in the English language: present and past. There is no such thing as the future tense. That might be groundbreaking for some of us, but excuse me. But there is no future tense. It's something that we've made up. And so therefore we can measure where we are, which is the present. We can measure where we've been, which is the past, but we really can't measure where we're going to be because it hasn't happened yet. So it's all hypothetical. So we notice that there's a T in our formula. Let me see if I can bring my marker up here. I'll do a highlighter. So I want you to also notice that the T has no parentheses around it. All right. And that's important. The T has no parentheses. When something doesn't have a parentheses, it means you have to have it. So every verb has to have a tense of either present or past. Secondly, is this M, and the M stands for modal. Modal is a type of helper that we have. And so modals, as you'll notice here, have this little parentheses around it. And so a modal is always going to be optional. When something has parentheses in the original verb expansion rule, it lets me know that it's going to be optional. So I don't have to have a modal, but you could. And so what I did is I listed the modals for you here. All right, it's very important we understand what a modal would be. Modals will show up either in past or present form. I've listed them that way. I listed the present first and the past second. So will and would are sort of partners. This is the present. This is the past. Shall and should are partners. Here's the present. Here's the past. Can and could are partners. Here's the present and the past. May and might, present and past. Must doesn't have a past tense. He's just present. Ought to, it's kind of hideous, but it is part of our verb. And ought to is present, but there is no past. Sometimes people think that must and ought to go together. They don't. So I want to make sure you realize they are not partners. They just don't have a past. This is what we call a modal. And then after that, we notice that in a verb expansion rule, we have a possibility of a have. And I want you to see that when I use the word have, en will come with it. And that's going to be interesting because they're going to be, once again, it's in parentheses, so it's optional. But anytime I use the word have or any form of the word have, let's see if I can change this over to a pen for us. So this means if I use the word has, or if I use the word had, or if I use the word have, any form of the word have, anytime I use that, I have to include en. All right, and I have to include this en. But I want you to think about it as I'm not adding have plus en. I'm adding have and then an en. Because if I glue this together, you'd end up having a word which says havin', and there's no such word as havin'. So why don't you just trust the fact that we're going to bring in a have and an en. Next thing you see over here is this be plus ing. Well, the be plus ing lets me know at any time I have a form of be, and this is any form of be. This would be like is, are, was, were, am, be, been. Anytime I have a form of be, I have to include the ing. They come as a pair, but once again, there's parentheses, which means you don't have to have it. But if you do have a be, the ing comes with it. Or think of it the opposite way. If you have an ing, the be has to come with it as well. Lastly, in our mathematical equation is this MV, which stands for main verb. Everybody has to have a main verb. So if you think about the way the verb expansion rule is written, you have to have a tense and you have to have a main verb. But you don't have to have the rest of these things. But sometimes we do. Sometimes we need an ing. Sometimes we need this have or has or had. And sometimes we need a modal. Just to kind of wrap up our work on modals before we move on to another screen. A modal basically affects the mood of the sentence. So we're going to get into moods next week, but we'll talk about the different types of moods that we have. And some of you who might be in upper levels of foreign language classes, you may have covered some of these already. Moods include things like the indicative mood, or the conditional mood, or the emphatic mood, or the subjunctive mood. But the modal actually helps create a particular mood of a verb. So what I want to do is I want to start off by looking at a verb and looking at how we can break down the verb and then reconstruct that verb. But I'm going to pause my video and then restart with a second part. Okay, so I'm just going to stop for right now.